Jesus said to Peter that you'll have the power to bind and to loose. Interesting words. Those words kind of have a scriptural grounding in healing stories that people who are bound are loosed, whether it be that they can't speak or can't see or can't walk. These are references to bind and to loose, but it also has to do with the spirituality around people who in Jesus' day felt like were possessed by demons even. To bind and to loose sounds so foreign from our modern sophisticated ways, though, doesn't it? We have Western medicine now to explain everything. We have diagnoses and procedures and you know, binding and loosing stuff. That's when they didn't know as much. I thought about that. How could we view this notion of things being bound and things being turned loose in a healing sense in our modern sophisticated ways? Revisionist History is a podcast by Malcolm Gladwell. It's one of my favorite podcasts. One of the episodes, Revisionist History is one of these things that it does like this deep dive on researching sometimes the most random things, but sometimes the most profound things. But in everything, it's really insightful. So I'd encourage you, if you're looking for a podcast, Revisionist History is one worth investing in. Gladwell does one in an episode entitled Generous Orthodoxy about a guy who is a Mennonite pastor. He was ordained Mennonite pastor, and his son, as an adult, comes out to him and says, you know, Dad, I'm gay. And not only that, but I've met someone, and I'd like for you, it'd mean a lot for me if you would do our wedding. Now, the father has a choice to make here. He either can honor the vows of his ordination, he can follow the rules of his church, which prohibited him from doing such a wedding, or he could be there at his son's request in this special, important, profound moment of life. It's a whole episode on the father's journey to ultimately, for him, decide to do the wedding for his son. That's an interesting episode, and we can kind of come down on different ways and nuances of understanding the father's decision. But what was really profound to me was the father, and you can find this online, wrote an open letter to his church. And it wasn't this anger-filled letter about how he felt the church was so wrong and all. It was just a letter of tenderness from a father who just decided, I'm going to give up my job, my calling in this formal sense, to love my son in a way that I feel is best. And there's a line in the letter that the father writes to his church that says, the church we serve today has the power to bind and to loose. See, this notion of binding and loosing is about more than just mystical healing stories. There are very real ways in which we are bound, and we can help set each other free to loosen those chains. We're doing the small group, as I mentioned, where we're kind of getting deeper into the sermons that you're hearing on Sundays. And one of the things we talked about, one of the most profound and highest clicked TED Talks you can find online is the one that Brene Brown did on vulnerability. Millions of views. I think it's up to like 20 million people have gone and watched this. Brene Brown is a sociologist who did a study on vulnerability that has just netted years and years of published works and books and speaking engagements. And it's because she touched on something extraordinarily deep. Vulnerability is our willingness to let the real person inside of us, the one that we cover up with all kinds of things because we're afraid to let the world see it, but it's to give others a glimpse of who that real person is. I believe in each of us, God has placed a unique person, but over time, we put up defense mechanisms. We block it, we shield it, we pretend to be something we're not. We want to be liked by everybody, so we don't want to show them this other side of us. Or we're just afraid, because if we show you the real us, if I show you the real me, what if you don't like it? What if you reject it? And that's scary. But here's one of the keys to vulnerability that Brene Brown has found. The more vulnerable you are, the more empathetic you become. Say that again. The more vulnerable you are, the more empathetic you can become. I believe there's a direct correlation between how vulnerable you can be and how empathetic you can be. The less vulnerable we are, we have the defense mechanisms up, we're a lot more likely to judge somebody else negatively. Oh, well, that person over there, they think this, they do this, they ought to be ashamed. By the way, the opposite of empathy for Brene Brown is shame. The less vulnerable we are, the more we give in to shame, whether it's shaming ourselves or trying to shame other people. We judge them negatively, harshly. But the more vulnerable we are, the more able we are to empathize with someone else, with their state, with who they are, with where they've come from, with their struggles, their hardships. That only happens when we're willing to be vulnerable, to take the risk. And that's the hard part about vulnerability, is it's a risk to be who we are. But when we're able to do it, we can unlock an extraordinary power in ourselves and for the sake of others. Jesus is walking down the street one day with his disciples. And casual conversation maybe. Who do the people say the Son of Man is? Kind of his way of talking in third person. Who do people say that I am? Well, prophet, Elijah, good moral example maybe, guy we ought to look up to, a nice guy, decent, law-abiding person. No big deal. And then he asked the question to them, but who do you say that I am? Sidestep that for a moment. Is that not a question we ought to be asking ourselves every day? Who is Jesus in my life? Who is Jesus in my life? Is he a moral example? Is he a nice guy? Somebody we ought to look up to maybe? He lived a good life. I agree with his stances on issues. Yes, that's one of our favorites. His platform, his party platform, we like that Jesus. Or is he a Savior? The Messiah? The Son of the living God? The one who can look through all the defense mechanisms in my life, all the garbage I heap on top of it, pretending to not be who I really am, and who can see that person deep down. And yeah, that person's a little bit broken. We all are. But the one who loves that person more than anything. So I didn't know the choir was going to sing this anthem, but what amazing words. Oh, the deep, deep love of Jesus. Simon Peter has the right answer. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Peter's an interesting character. Peter's a natural-born leader. He's also a hothead. He's impulsive. Peter's the guy in the garden that when they come to arrest Jesus, before anyone can say a word, he whips out his sword and chops the guy's ear off. He's impulsive. A little bit of a temper on him. Peter also had moments where he lacked courage, denied Jesus 3 times. But Peter, as his life progresses, is redeemed. That out of that denial, the resurrection, we talked about this a couple weeks ago, the resurrection impacts his life in such a unique way. Why? Because he knew how broken he was, how much of a failure he was. Resurrection takes on a deeper meaning when we know how much we need it. That goes beyond agreeing with it, liking it, enjoying it. But to need it more than anything in life, to need to be redeemed, to experience new life, another start. That's the power of resurrection. Jesus tells Peter, you are the rock upon which I will build my church. And you'll have all kinds of authority. You'll be a leader. You're going to lead that church. I have to believe that there must have been, later in life for Peter, in that moment of struggle and redemption, that he must have remembered back to these initial words where Jesus changed his name, spoke a word of life into him, reminded him who he was no matter what. You are the rock upon which I will build my church. Jesus told Peter who he was. Jesus tells each of us who we are. Deep down, looks inside of us to those places we want to hide from the rest of the world. And he not only tells us who we are, but he loves us, even in spite of the shortcomings. Jesus tells Peter, you have the power to bind and to loose things. And I believe each one of us has the power to bind and to loose things in another person's life. Through the ways we empathize with them instead of judging them. Through the ways we offer them a word of grace and love instead of anger and hatred. The ways that we just pause, even when we don't agree with each other, and say, rather than just struggling with the fact that I don't agree with you, maybe I need to understand where you're coming from. Why you think that, why you say that, why you might feel that way. And in doing that, I need to get in touch with what it draws up inside of me that could be a little bit ugly too. But maybe in considering that, we can loosen each other's chains that we seem to live in, set each other free. A couple weeks ago, I took a group from this church to Asbury Memorial to meet with our bishop and entire cabinet, district superintendents, the power players, if you will, of the South Georgia Annual Conference. And we went there for a simple purpose, and the purpose was that it was members from Trinity and members from Asbury Memorial who are LGBTQ, and the bishop said, I'd like to meet to hear how we can learn to be better pastors and better churches to persons who are LGBTQ or their family members. Now, the reality is I kind of went in there, a little cynical and a little anxious. I'm cynical because I struggle sometimes at the church. I think we're always playing catch up to how we ought to be the most loving and gracious and open community possible. So I'm a little cynical that we're going to, invoke change. And I'm a little anxious because these are my people that I'm taking into a meeting. I don't want their feelings to get hurt. Because I'm going to be honest with you. I don't really care what your office is. If you hurt one of my church members' feelings, it's on them. So I'm a little anxious going into it. But I don't know what change could have happened as a result, but I'll tell you what I witnessed. I witnessed people who represent the church graciously stay quiet. And I listened to people who, disciples of Jesus Christ, faithful church members, doing amazing things in their life and in the life of the church, leaders, share their story to people who represent an institution that has not always done a good job of listening to everybody's story. And for me, even for just that afternoon, it's kind of profound because stories change people. When we take the time to listen to each other's story, it's a lot harder to judge someone harshly. We may not agree with them, but that distance where like when you go online and you read the comments on something, it's always just the most awful things possible. Well, it's because there's a distance in the internet that you don't care what you say because there's this huge chasm of distance. You just say it. But in life, when we hear each other's stories, the distance gets closer. It's hard to hate someone close up when you hear their story, when you know them. They become real. They become a person. They become vulnerable. And you do too, by the way, when you stop, listen, when you're willing to learn. This series, Everybody Always, I love this series because I'm learning along with you that to be resurrection people, to live in the light of the resurrection, means growing to learn to love people the way that Jesus does. I debated whether or not to tell the story, and I'm just going to tell it, so forgive me for the example, but I think there's something here. So Bob Goff, who's written this book, he tells the story we heard in the small group. His son's a skydiver, and he thinks his son's crazy, but instead of just continue to think he's crazy, Bob goes and he learns to skydive himself, and he surprises his son one day by joining him for a skydiving trip. Bob says you learn in skydiving school that when you jump out of the plane and if the parachute doesn't work, and say the terrible thing happens, right? The inconceivable thing happens and you hit the ground, that it's not on initial impact that somebody dies. That actually This is terrible. Your body kind of bounces, and it's on the second that you die. Horrible, right? I told you it was a bad story. But keep that story. You're not going to be able to forget that story now. He said, what if we could catch people on the bounce? Figuratively. Every one of us has a moment in life at some point or another where we hit rock bottom. But what if we could be there for the sake of each other? And if the first bounce, if the first impact on rock bottom is not what kills us, what if we could catch people before that second bounce? To lift them up, to hold them up, to love them. And you know why it's important that we do that for each other? Because somebody did it once for you. I guarantee you, somebody in your life at some terrible point was there for you, caught you on the bounce when you had hit rock bottom, lifted you up, supported you, loved you, spoke a word of truth into your life, not about the mistakes you may have made or the terrible thing you were going through, but about you, that you are loved, that you matter, that you're important, that God made you, and you're special, unique, and you're called and made to be the most amazing person ever. What if we could spend our week, rather than focusing on all the negative stuff in life, on the news and the drama in our own lives and all the negativity around us? You know, we feed off negativity. We tend to do that as human beings. I think it makes us feel alive, maybe, but drama is just something that kind of keeps the blood pressure up and keeps us moving. What if we could flip that script, though, and instead of focusing on all the negativity and all the drama, what if we could look for the positive in each other? Somebody raised in the small group, just a simple thing. Every person that you meet in the service industry over the next week, whether it's a bank teller, a waiter, or a waitress, whoever it may be, what if you took an extra 5 seconds in that encounter to say, thank you so much, you're doing such a good job. Simple, right? But rather than being so, inwardly focused and absorbed in ourselves, we look beyond ourselves to tell the story of goodness in others. Jesus didn't fuss at the disciples, by the way, for the wrong answers. But he did say to Peter, this is who you are. You are right. You are a rock, even with that bad temper. You are a leader, even though you're a little impulsive. You are called to love and to serve. For my sake, Jesus says. He says that to you. Each one of you. And he calls you to share that good news with others in the ways you live and interact and love with others. Everybody. Always. Amen.